So we're going to talk presidential powers. We're starting on page 348, chapter 12. This would be constitutional powers, powers that are in the Constitution for the president, and then perspective, etc. So, okay. The contemporary or the modern presidency hardly resembles the one of the Constitution's framers designed in 1787. The executive office, the presidency, they conceived had more limited authority, fewer responsibilities, and much less organizational structure than today's presidency. The framers feared both anarchy and monarchy. They wanted an independent executive, but disagreed about both the form the office should take and the powers it should exercise. In the end, they created an executive unlike any the world has ever seen. Okay. The Constitution says remarkably little about presidential power. The discussion of the presidency begins with these general words. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Now, Hamilton would argue that word vested, the executive power shall be vested, could make a large presidency because executives at that time were kings, and kings had a lot of power. So that wording actually is a good discussion about meaning to different people. It goes on to list just a few powers. The framers' invention fit nicely within the Madisonian system of shared power in checks and balances, forcing the president to obtain the support of officials in the other branches of government. Institutional balance was essential to the convention delegates, so the ones writing the Constitution, remember back chapter 2, who had in mind the abuses of past executives, both kings and colonial governors, but also the excesses of state legislatures. At the time of this writing, many state governors had term limits of only one. And you'll see this still in Virginia. Virginia, you can only be a governor for 4 years, and then you're done. And that was that fear of executives, colonial governors, king. They did not create a term limit for the presidency, even though they knew, how to do that. They understood the concept. The big problem then became is in the states is by giving too little power to executives, they ended up giving too much power to state legislatures. And I bring all this up because it shows there's always been problems and concerns about balance of power, whether it be at the state level at that time more so, or now especially at the federal level, the national level. The problem was how to preserve the balance without jeopardizing the independence of the separate branches or impeding or blocking the lawful exercise of their authority. The framers resolved this problem, or tried to resolve this problem, by checking those powers they believed to be most dangerous, the ones that historically have been subject to the greatest abuse. So what they knew as being the greatest abuse, they tried intentionally to limit. This was a few hundred years ago. Things have changed. For example, they gave Congress the power to declare war and the Senate the power to approve treaties and presidential appointments, while protecting the general spheres of authority from encroachment. So you couldn't go too much into those spheres and take from them. The executive, for instance, was given a qualified veto, checks and balances. Provisions for re-election and a short term of office also encouraged presidential responsibilities. For those executives who flagrantly abused their authority, impeachment was the ultimate recourse. So impeachment is a check. For the short term of office, there was talk about having like 1 6-year term. Instead, they opted for 4-year term with re-election. This was great. This was discussed often throughout the convention. Another issue was, should we only have 1 president or maybe 3? It sounds odd to us now, but there was considerable thought to the idea of having 3 presidents, and then majority wins, 2 to 1, and they would pick different people or different men from different regions of the country. Obviously, though, they settled on one. And as we talked about in the beginning, lots of discussion about who picks the president. And of course, they ultimately went with the states pick the president. States determine how they exercise their electoral votes for president. Okay, that's the past. Today, there's more to presidential power than the Constitution alone suggests, and that power comes from or is derived from many sources. The role of the president has changed as America has increased its prominence on the world stage. Technology has also reshaped the presidency. George Washington's ragtag militias, mostly disbanded by the time the first commander-in-chief took command, they weren't all, he tried to make them more trained than militias, just so you know, that were much different from the mighty nuclear arsenal that today's president commands. Presidents themselves have taken the initiative to develop new roles for the office. In fact, many presidents have enlarged the power of the presidency by expanding the president's responsibilities and political resources. Jefferson was the first leader of a mass political party, Democrat Republicans. Andrew Jackson presented himself as the direct representative of the people. He is considered the first common man's president. We can discuss whether Andrew Jackson was a good president, but he was known to allow people to drink on the White House and get drunk on the White House lawns, and act like men who drink act on the White House lawns. Abraham Lincoln, of course, mobilized the country for war. Theodore Roosevelt mobilized the public behind his policies. He and Wilson set precedent for presidents to serve as world leaders. Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt developed the role of the president as manager of the economy. During the 50s and 60s, it was fashionable for political scientists, historians, and commentators to favor a powerful presidency. By the 70s, many felt differently. Johnson and the unpopular Vietnam War made people reassess the role of presidential power, and Nixon and the Watergate scandal heightened public distrust. The Nixon era was followed by the presidencies of Ford and Carter, whom many critics saw as weak leaders and failures. Remember, it says many critics saw, not sure if they truly were. Although Reagan experienced short periods of great influence, more typically he was frustrated in achieving his goals as the American political system settled back into its characteristic mode of stalemate and incremental policymaking. The Iran-Contra affair, in which some White House aides engaged in illegal activities, kept concern about a tyrannical presidency alive, while Reagan's inability in most instances to sway Congress evoked a desire on the part of some for a stronger presidency. Reagan's immediate successors, George H.W., Bill Clinton, often find it difficult to get things done. The presidencies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama raised anew the issue of presidential power. Bush asserted an expansive view of the president's constitutional powers, including withholding information from Congress under the doctrine of executive privilege, issuing statements asserting the right to disregard certain provisions of laws he signed. Those are called signing statements. That came up a lot under George W., signing statements, where when he signed a bill into law, he would make little notes and say, I'm not going to, this is how I interpret this law as the executive. Making his interpretation part of the law, so to speak, or part of the enforcement of the law. Ordering without warrants electronic surveillance of individuals, I believe that was foreign individuals or individuals talking to people outside the country, and holding prisoners without trial for indefinite periods. I think they're talking here about the Guantanamo Bay. That still exists. Obama said he was going to get those prisoners out. They're still there. They're still there under Trump. The problem is they've never had a trial, but where do they go? Americans protested the idea of them coming to the U.S. soil. These were people picked up in like Afghanistan, probably right around the time you were born or earlier, depending on when you hear this. The U.S. doesn't want them, and then other countries don't want them, so they sit in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba in our prison system It's been for a while. Obama continued many of his predecessors' practices. He also actively used drones to kill terrorists, even American citizens, without trial, not on American soil, though this was in Pakistan, and presided over a massive electronic surveillance effort. Once again, critics charged the presidential power threatened the constitutional balances of powers. Yeah, a lot of people don't really, a lot of liberals were not happy with Obama. They thought he was just a continuation of many of George W. Bush's foreign policies. We will talk in class about what's called the imperial presidency, the idea of these expanding powers of the president. And it starts probably right around World War II, the end of World War II. And ever since then, it's just gotten more aggressively so that the one man gets to make a lot of foreign policy choices, and whether or not that's good or bad. And it's definitely not part of the original intention of the Constitution. We'll also talk about that in the power of the presidency and whether or not Congress should take some of that power back. And we have done examples of that before. We have in class. The example on the top of my head is when they did the Defense Reauthorization Act, they stepped up and wrote in there that a president can't move money. They started to target more of the money towards what they specifically wanted to see the money go to, because they found if they keep it too general, the president chooses, which is great if you agree with the president. But it does take power away from Congress. Okay, president or prime minister. The framers chose a presidential system of government for the U.S. Most democracies in developed countries, however, have chosen a parliamentary system. In such a system, the chief executive, known as the prime minister, is selected by the members of the legislature from among themselves, rather than by the voters. More specifically, the majority party, or the largest block of voters in the legislature, if there is a no majority party. Remember back in elections, they create coalitions when they have proportional representation in a parliament. Jog your memory on that. If you don't remember, look it up. The majority party votes its party leader to be prime minister. The prime minister may remain in power for a long time, as long as his or her party or coalition has a majority of the seats and supports the leader. So, Prime Minister of England, Corbyn, I believe, is a member of the Conservative Party, and they are the ones dominating the British Parliament. You don't vote directly for him. But when you do vote, you know that's the person who will become prime minister. So it does have an influence. No, Corbyn was the one they didn't like. Shame on me. Boris Johnson is the prime minister. Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and that had an influence on people not wanting to vote for Labour because they didn't like him. So Boris Johnson is the prime minister. The prime minister of Canada is Trudeau, and his dad, by the way, was prime minister decades ago. And he, again, is a member of and I'm not sure what the name of the party is, if it's called the Liberal Party, but it is the Liberals that are in charge right now. When I use the word liberal and conservative, don't think of it as Democrat, Republican. Their version of conservative and liberals are different. Actually, in England, liberal is actually conservative, but liberal that I'm talking about is liberal, but it's a different liberal than here. None of that is on a test. Just know, don't use American politics directly with other countries' political parties in politics. They're different. Okay, so presidents and prime ministers govern quite differently. Prime ministers never face divided government, for example. Since they represent the majority party or coalition, they can almost always depend on winning votes in the legislature. In addition, party discipline is better in parliamentary systems than in the U.S. Parties know that if the prime minister should lose on an important vote, he might have to call for an immediate election to try to obtain a working majority under unfavorable circumstances. As a result, members of parliament almost always support their leaders. Prime ministers generally differ in background from presidents as well. They must be party leaders, as we have seen, and they are usually very effective communicators with skills honed in the rough and tumble of parliamentary debate. In addition, they have had substantial experience dealing with national issues, unlike American governors who may move directly into the presidency. Cabinet members, who are usually senior members of parliament, have similar advantages. Okay, so to note on this, the prime minister is his ability or her ability, because there's definitely been women here, are like more like the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, at this moment when I'm reading this. They know all the background work, and they know how to move their coalition, their caucus, and get things through. Think of a prime minister like that. Also to note, cabinet members in our country, cabinet members are outside of Congress. They're chosen to be part of the executive branch. The executive branch in England, in parliamentarian systems, are within their parliament, their version of Congress. So a secretary or a cabinet member is actually a member of parliament too. They don't have that division. They used to have more of a division because they had a king or queen with Queen Victoria, but the king's position, or now queen's position, has diminished. So think it's a different system, obviously. So why does the U.S. maintain a presidential system? The framers were concerned about the concentration of power and wanted to separate power so that the different branches could check each other. More concerned with the abuse of power than its effective use, they chose a presidential system. It says the first the world has ever known. I don't know if that's true. I'm going to have to assume it's true, but I would want to look that up to confirm.